Hi, I'm Addison K. Witt, Poet Laureate of the Defense of Democracy and host of this podcast. The attack on America's public school system isn't slowing down, but neither are we. Here you'll meet authors, educators, students, and defenders from across the country who aren't just sounding the alarm, they're answering it. You'll be informed, you'll be moved, and if we've done our job right, you'll be ready to stand with us. This is the Defense of Democracy podcast. Let's get into it. Hello, I'm Addison K. Witt, Poet Laureate of the Defense of Democracy and host of the Defense of Democracy podcast. You know, there are moments in our country's life when the loudest conversations are not necessarily the most important ones. Then there are the conversations that sit just beneath the surface, where people begin to ask themselves questions they can no longer ignore. What do I actually believe? How did I come to believe it? And perhaps more importantly, have I been thinking freely? Or have I been thinking within something I never chose? We're living in a time where political identity has become deeply personal, not just something we vote with, but something we carry, we defend, and in many cases, we've inherited. And yet at the same time, we are watching a growing number of Americans step slightly outside of that structure, not abandoning their values, but beginning to question the containers, the framework those values have been placed in. Nearly half the country now identifies as independent, I believe like 45%. And that raises a fascinating question, or at least fascinating to me. Are people becoming more free in their thinking, or simply more aware of the limitations of the choices they've been given? Today's conversation is not about choosing a side. It's about examining the space between sides, the space where lived experience meets history, where ideology meets reality, and where thoughtful people begin to ask whether political identity is clarifying who we are or narrowing it. My guest today is someone who spends a great deal of time in that space, thinking, writing, and challenging the assumptions that often go unquestioned. Today, we're here to explore. Welcome back to the conversation, Conor Broll. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this since we started batting this back and forth a few weeks ago, so happy to be here again.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure definitely to have you here. And this time I did things a little bit differently. I actually wrote my questions down, so I've got them right in front of me. And I know you've been super busy. I've been following you on Substack and all the things that you're doing, and you're always so insightful. I really love your point of view and what you oftentimes have to say. So, what have you been working on lately?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you again for having me. And it's funny, you've written your questions down, so I hope it doesn't turn to a cross-examination. But
Not
I'll
at
do
all.
my best. No, I'm kidding, of course. So I've rebranded the Substack. Last time I was on here, it was Threat of Dissent, and now it's Beyond Ideology. And we've talked about this, but for the listeners, that was really motivated by exactly what your intro was talking about, right? Which initially we had talked about this on the first time I was on. I wanted to write for those people who felt they were left outside of the binary. And as I continued to write for Threat of Dissent, I started to realize that, and it's tough in this moment, but particularly what was going on with ICE, and I was involved here in New York City with the protests, I realized that I was becoming what I was writing against to an extent, that I was becoming a bit of an ideologue. And you and I talked on our last phone call. It sometimes it felt to me it's a bit of a betrayal sometimes to turn away from politics in this very dire moment, or what feels like a very dire moment. I don't think that's us being alarmist in the present. I think history will regard it as so as well. But I realized that if I was going to continue to put myself into this echo chamber that I had been writing against, then I was part of the problem. And so from there, I came up with the idea of calling it Beyond Ideology, and I wanted to go beyond ideology. And what that is continuing to do the political writing, but injecting history, culture, the things that make us human. And that's rooted in the belief that politics or history and culture are down. Politics is downstream of history and culture, and that's something that we don't really think in this moment, right? In the modern age, people adopt their ideologies wholesale, whereas ideologies used to be the end product of a lifetime worth of learning and experiencing. It was more of a manifestation of a coherent worldview. Now I think strongly that people take their ideology and that becomes their worldview. Everything else comes from that. And I think the reason we're at this impasse where we are right now as a country is because of, as you were referencing before, people's entire identities are now their ideologies. They're adopted without any kind of reflection or independent thought. I mean, they're prepackaged, bought, and sold.
You bring up so many really great points here, and as I listen to you, I can't help but think about the ability to self-examine, self-awareness, because you pointed out from your own reflection of what you thought you were becoming based on what you were saying and being a part of a larger echo chamber. And you yourself took a step back. And I think that's one of the areas within our current society where we don't self-reflect as much. We're in the live and let live, and it doesn't matter. I'm all my opinions. Um, you know, I often say when people talk about, well, it's my opinion, but not every opinion is correct. Even our own opinions, we have to reflect. We have to re-examine oftentimes what we believe. So, how do you get to that point of your own self-reflection and examination?
Well, I think with most good pieces of self-reflection, it tends to come from an external kick in the rear sometimes. So a buddy of mine, one of my closest friends I went to grad school with, and we're collaborating. It's funny, I say collaborating, it makes it sound like we're in the French Resistance, but we're working together on this Beyond Ideology project. He's a conservative and I'm a liberal. And, we've had a similar personal trajectory and socioeconomic trajectory and then career trajectory. And it's funny, if we're talking liberal conservative debate, we disagree on almost anything. But then what I realized was in the terms of the present moment, we agree on almost we're on the same side on most of these issues because the dialogue has gone so far outside of the traditional liberal conservative debate that was a debate within liberalism. Now we've got the autocratic fringes that liberals and conservatives, I think, really are natural allies. And that kind of made me realize in conversation with him that he would call me on these things, right? When I'm being a bit too ideological in the moment and I'm getting caught up in the emotion of the moment to take a step back. So I owe a lot of credit to him, of course, for giving me that initial kick.
That used to be a really safe space in America where we could talk about our uh, most basic beliefs, right, and viewpoints, and have those discussions with people on the left, people on the right. I think someone recently on Facebook, a good friend of mine, said, "What happened to that time when we could just earnestly debate and have conversations, and through those conversations grow and become better community, better society, better country?" Why do you think so many Americans struggle to remain in that middle space without immediately being claimed by one political tribe or the other?
I mean, I think more than anything else, it's natural. Human tendency to break off into tribes is natural. I mean, if we want to, not to go on a whole historical tangent here, I'll try to refrain myself. But if we look at Western liberalism, it's not only societies based on ideas, but the idea of societies, I mean, society in general based on an idea, right? Social contract theory, what have you. That's not a natural biological phenomenon. It's, people, state of nature and tribalism is much more natural. So one could argue that the whole liberal experiment is kind of going against nature. I don't think that certainly makes it a bad thing. But so people naturally want to break off into their affinity groups, right? The problem is now, I think, with social media, that it's becoming entirely rampant. I mean, you're pressured by social media and your peers to do it. It's cloud. It's just groupthink run riot because it's in the digital age. Well, one of the main reasons I'm a liberal is because I think liberalism, small L liberalism, political liberalism, it sprouts from open-mindedness, skepticism, critical thinking, small L liberalism. I had to have those things before I became a liberal. And one of my biggest problems about this siphoning or this bipolarization is that it's rooted in the illiberal practice of shutting off people who are different from you.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Shutting off people who are different from. There was a quote I was looking at earlier that says, Let's show up to those who are different from us instead of screaming at them words of judgment or only accepting them if they assimilate into our ways. That's a quote by Aaron Jones, a author and educator I was speaking with recently. And I thought that's really interesting because in order to do that, my question is, well, how do we get to that place? And in order to do that, you have to really be thoughtful, conscientious. You have to really think about other people and remove yourself from just seeing from your own point of view and be empathetic to someone else's way of living and experiencing life.
I agree. And it's funny, in this part of the project, this was kind of subsidiary, but just as it evolved, the Beyond Ideology project, one way to do that, to make you, first of all, you have to make the other person seem human, not the sum of their ideas or their ideology. And I think the first step, and always interpersonally or ideologically or philosophically, is to find and highlight common ground. And part of the, now every Sunday, Saturday on Substack, I'm publishing a book review, whatever I've got my nose into. And then Sunday, marrying that with a cultural piece, what movie I watched this week, or play, or what have you, museum exhibit, and that's to cast a wider net. I mean, I love doing that writing, but also ideologically speaking, you're casting a wider net than my just polemical writing, right? And I think the first step in us building this kind of coalition to push back against this frankly castration of the mind, for lack of a better term, is realizing what we have in common and emphasizing our shared cultural inheritance. Now, a lot of times the right takes these kind of terms like cultural inheritance. It sounds kind of conservative, and they take it and, they'll always talk about Western civilization or what have you. I mean, that too, the fact that that's been politicized is part of the problem. We share certain human characteristics, love of art, love of music, that transcends boundaries, often arbitrary geographic boundaries drawn on a map. And I think truly by emphasizing these shared human passions, that is the only way we're ever going to be able to move past this state where we're just mired in hostility and ideological tribalism.
I've had a chance, as I said, to read some of your writings, and I love the phrase beyond ideology. And let me see. Do you think ideology has become a substitute for thought in America, for the thinking person, that our ideology now speaks for us?
I do. And kind of what I was talking about earlier, where ideology used to be this sum total of one's experiences, thoughts, lived experiences, thoughts, and research, reading, whatever you want to call it. It is now the starting point, right? And that's the problem. One adopts their ideology kind of like they would don a winter coat, and that's their winter coat for the rest of their lives in most cases. There's not much thought given to it. It's just, and then from there they move forward, and it really dictates one's worldview. I mean, when you arrive, I arrived at undergrad as product of a conservative Catholic family. I'm the only liberal, secular urbanite in my family to this day. I arrived having to do a lot of work, right? And that was the beauty of a liberal arts education. I was trending in that direction anyway. And it challenged some of the beliefs that I'd grown up my entire life. Fast forward to graduate school, and I've got people who are further to the left than I am, who had arrived there, most from undergrad, which I think is very telling. I had worked in politics in the interim, but they arrived with their wholesale beliefs and then attempted, as historians, they didn't even examine that, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the first step you have to do as a historian. Then from there, everything came out of that. As speaking as a historian, your conclusion should be drawn from your research. Your research should not be drawn from your conclusions. And I think that metaphor is what we're talking about with one's ideology, their entire personalities and interests, and thus their social circles and their lived experience stems from this artificial ideology that they've adopted for whatever reasons, whether it's social acceptance or moral grandstanding, whatever it is. It could just be fear of the unknown. I'm not saying these are all negative reasons to adopt an ideology. I'm just saying ideology in many ways has kind of become, to misquote Karl Marx, has kind of become the opiate of the people. Mm-hmm. I mean, and it's like everybody's religion now is their ideology.
And what do you think that's saying for us at this point in history? What does that mean, that we're now focused, or we're using our ideology as sort of our red badge of courage? It sort of leads the way.
I mean, I think it's exactly why we're where we are right now. because we're in
Yeah.
these camps where we go out. I mean, social media is basically, as far as I'm concerned, it's a confirmation bias maximizer, where it's completely bifurcated us. I think what you have is this ideological rigidity that you had with, I'd say, coming out of arguably, I think we would both agree the culture wars from the 60s are still going on, right?
Yeah.
And the Reagan years were trying to push back against that, and they've now been reignited, at least since 2016. I think they've always been going on, but I would argue since then people have been incredibly ideological. This is not a new phenomenon. I think what changes is in the 1990s you start having cable radio, political radio, or cable news and talk radio, which is getting increasingly politicized. So then people are continuing to entrench themselves in these camps. And then social media comes along. And I think really it's just like an injection of steroids into this rampant polarization. And this is where we are. I mean, it's gone you saw with talk radio a bit and CNN and Fox News wars, whatever you want to call it. But people were starting to live in alternate information realities. And that's where we are now. I don't think you can decouple the two of them. It's gotten much worse because of the technology. I mean, I recently went back on Twitter to just merely to promote my work, or X. I haven't been on in 10 years. My God, I mean, to call it the Wild West is to do a disservice to the Wild West.
Yeah, it's completely changed. Absolutely.
It's like Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, it's completely changed. And that's something that I was really curious about, and just listening to you, because we talked about the influence and impact that media has had, and as we have moved forward and are moving forward into AI, and we're all in these various camps, we can't even agree on the same facts. People who believe one way, whether it's conservative versus those who are much more liberal, they're operating on a completely separate or different facts. So the first thing to do is to even agree on what the facts are.
Right. And I don't know how we do that.
It's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation and get to solutions.
And I don't even know how we do it. Maybe what we have to start with is we have to begin with principles, and certain principles that used to be not controversial, as in like what happened in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776, was inherently a good thing. I think perhaps that's a good place to start in terms of national renewal. That used to be liberals, conservatives that wasn't up for debate, right? Mm-hmm. Nowadays, that's certainly not the case. And I've written a bit about, in my recent piece, because I was a foreign policy guy in graduate school, in the war in Iran, which I by no means support, but the initial reaction was purely, I think, channeled through anti-Trump, which is fine. I'm in that camp. It's not fine that it was done that way. It's understandable, but we have to take a zoom out here and look at things in the long view, right? And then on the flip side of the coin, I think a lot of the support that you see sometimes for America's adversaries is rooted in a reflexive anti-American, anti-Western bias that we're kind of talking about with some of this ideological rigidity. And these are completely beyond the pale of what foreign policy arguments used to be, or debates used to be about, like the domestic political debates too. I mean, we have to agree on something. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I can't think of anything else easier to agree on about than America being a good thing.
I was thinking, as I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking about the founding fathers and what they had to say, the principles they believed in. And then it made me think about populations. And at that time, you're talking about 4 million people versus 330 million people today. And so many more people to agree on information. And then I was talking to someone about running for a political position and losing by less than 1%. And so often we as Americans are so close to choosing one direction or another direction. So it's interesting how evenly we are divided, but we have very deeply entrenched beliefs about our democracy, whether you're even using the word democracy. We are a constitutional republic, which we know that we are, but we're operating off of democratic principles, right? But even that is difficult for some people to accept as a fact.
Sure. No, I would agree. And I think So related to this, and something we could all agree on, and when I wrote my piece on when I was participating in the ICE protest here in New York, was
Mhm.
that the title of my piece was called "Citizenship as Resistance," because that used to be the it's an attainable identity, right? It's not based on any kind of class or ethnicity. One can choose to be a citizen, and citizen obviously has duties as well as privileges. And I think we need to start talking about ourselves as citizens again, related to America. If we're talking about citizens, anyone can become an American citizen. And I firmly believe, frankly, that not to say the real American citizens, because I think that's a fascist statement to say something like that. But you hear it a lot on the right. But to push back against that, or Trump's right, I should say, not to malign conservatives. Um, Frankly, the people who've immigrated here, as far as I'm concerned, deserve to be called citizens more than anybody who was born here. They've
Mhm.
chosen to be here in this country, and we're seeing an assault on citizenship with this, right?
Yes.
So all of us, we should middle America, and that's what I was urging in this piece, was to not isolate middle America by turning these into something that they're not. These ICE protests. Okay, we can talk about citizenship, right? Citizenship goes across the partisan divide. Notions of America and liberalism and the founders of small liberalism goes across the party divide, and these are the things we need. As you rightly pointed out, 45% of Americans are now independent.
I think you're right. It's about values as Americans, as citizens of this nation, and how we. Uh, I think there is a relearning that's very necessary. Relearning how to respect each other. What does that mean? What does that look like publicly? Whether it's your neighbor, people in your family. I think there are a lot of principles that have to be reintroduced to us. Speaking of your writing, you recently wrote, "You cannot read your way into understanding who you are. Sooner or later, you have to encounter it." What have you encountered about yourself that reading alone could never have taught you?
Yeah, so this will touch on a few different threads. I grew up Irish Catholic, and we've talked about how I had to move away from that secular and to become a
Mhm.
secularist. So in many ways, I was always ambivalent about my Irish ancestry. Right, there were some characterological, some of the stereotypes about the Irish that I saw, negative stereotypes that I saw reflected in myself, led me to keep the Irish at arm's length. And so that, coupled with my work as a historian studying the British Empire, it's kind of hard to write about the English a lot, and also write about the English and the Irish, sometimes
Mhm.
mutually exclusive in history, violently mutually exclusive. But so I went to a big road trip of the UK back in September, and we were flying out of Dublin, and kind of as an afterthought, we bounced down to Cork for a day and a half, where my family's from in Ireland. And still, I was ambivalent until the wheels of the plane touched the ground down at Cork, and I just felt some kind of a weird peace come over me, a kind of a homecoming. And then as we were going around the city itself the next day, and I kept having these weird interactions when people were saying things to me that seemed like something I would say. For example, I was this woman about my age, a little bit older, was coming through a coffee shop, and I stood back to let her go, and we kind of did the dance. And I said, "No, go ahead." And she had a wooden spoon, and she shook it at me, and she said, "If you didn't, I would have hit you with it." And I walked away. I'm like, I would have said something like that. And I was on this weird wavelength. I felt like I'd never felt on the same wavelength with the people around me before. And it all just kind of made sense. And then I realized that, I had met myself in an Irish mirror. And you couldn't read your way into that. I couldn't read myself into feeling like an Irishman. I had to go to Ireland and experience people who were probably somehow related to me, and see myself reflected back in the good qualities in them.
I think that makes a great deal of sense. I know exactly what you're talking about, especially being from Texas and having spent a great deal of my life in California and other places and living outside the country even for a while. However, there was always an incredible peace in returning to my birthplace where I was born. I've mentioned this before in a previous conversation I've had, where I grew up on a farm and in East Texas, and for many years, returning to that place, specifically the land itself, gave me this incredible peace, regardless of what was happening in the world. I always felt connected to that place and the people there. So I know that sense of um, there's an inner story that's being told that you can only experience when you are connected to that place.
it is very almost like supernatural. It's hard to even quantify in words.
Yeah, it certainly can be. You also, in your travels, I don't know if this was the same trip, but I saw some photos of you when you were in Rome. And I was just wondering when you stood there in Rome and felt the centuries collapse into one walk, because when you're traveling and you're seeing these incredible architecture and historic buildings that have meant so much to the world, you get a sense of the place, right? The history it's felt. Did that deepen your sense that civilizations rarely recognize their own fragility while they're living inside of it?
I think, well, I should say yes, but to get to that point, Rome, history in Rome kind of smacked me in the face. Like the Irish came and smacked me in the face. It was my first night. I was kind of jet lagged, and for one, I studied ancient Roman imperial history in undergrad, but I didn't really know much about the city itself. So it was nice to have a sense of wanderlust. But I was in some run of the mill, and I don't mean run of the mill to denigrate. I mean because so many beautiful Baroque churches in Rome, and I was up looking at the beautiful fresco, and then bouncing down the street, and then I saw these ruins, and these were the first Roman ruins I had seen, kind of in the middle of a piazza, kind of this reaching skyward, like the spine of a dinosaur or something out on the Great Plains or something. But and then I went up and realized that's where Caesar had been assassinated. And that's when Rome really just smacked me in the face. That I had gone from some beautiful church 2 blocks later to one of the most significant spots in Western history, and I just stumbled upon it. And to your point, and then I spent the next day ad nauseum. I mean, 7 hours at the Forum, which I could only do when I was alone because I don't think anybody else is that obsessed with these things. But yeah, to your point, I mean, the city was built to last, and I don't think there's any sense of imperial decline. I mean, well, yes and no, because I think you always see people screaming about imperial decline,
Mm-hmm.
right? Within people, usually people who are defenders of empire.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a general sense sometimes, but I think that also gets into the kind of good old days mentality that we're all prone to, right? The nostalgia factor that, oh, things used to be better
Used to
back
be
in my
right.
day.
Yeah.
So yes and no. I mean, the weird thing with America is that there's a sense of denial about us being an empire, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure where that came from, because you go look at Washington D.C. and it's clearly inspired by ancient Rome. I mean, there was
Mm-hmm.
an imperial aspirational value in the art that reflected in the architecture of the early republic. That it's funny because they should have known better, because they all studied ancient Rome, the founders, and really put themselves on the side of the Cicero and Cato and Brutus and those who opposed the dictatorship. Yet, so they knew what happened when republics died and empires were formed, right? They knew the
Sure.
corruption of the Roman Senate, and yet they go out and build an empire. It's kind of this weird thing where you can't really escape it, right? There's these cyclical life cycles of empires that no matter how hard you try, there's overreach and extension,
That's right.
and I think we with the Iran crisis, or war, I think we might be there. I mean, I think we've been trending that way for a long time, but now it really looks like perhaps with our allies or former allies, unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, we're now like an isolated empire. That's
And don't you think sometimes when that decline happens, it's because the the empire, the nation, has built values and principles that are no longer applicable for the world that has been created, right? So the founding fathers created a system of governance that served where they were based on history and previous civilizations. But now, 250 years down the road, we live in a completely different and more and in a world that's very different from the set of principles that were created for their time.
I think so to an extent. I mean, I think there seems to be the world is trending away from liberalism. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. You're seeing some right wing. I don't know if you're seeing a kind of a blossoming of autocracy around the world, included
Mm-hmm.
in this
Yes,
country.
yes.
Whether or not I don't know whether or not I think that's a permanent move away, because
Mm-hmm.
thus far we have not been faced with the kind of totalitarian autocracies that democracy defeated in the 20th century with the Nazis and the communists. So I think what happens is we came out of that, we meaning the United States, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, thinking that universal democracy was a universally valued phenomenon. And then
Right.
we went out and tried to build democracy.
Yeah.
I think democracy is the best system that humans have yet come up with. I don't think it's best for everyone.
Hmm.
It's and it's not really ours to decide that.
So then, do you think America's deeper problems right now are policy, leadership, or is it about the language we use?
I think all, but I think it starts with language, ends in leadership, and I'll explain this, but it starts in language, ends in leadership, and then policy is forgotten beneath that. So what I mean by the language, we'll call it the prevailing rhetoric, which is everything we're
Mhm.
talking about, where everything's built for going viral. There's no content to it in terms, well, the content in the modern sense of the world. I mean content and actually having any kind of weight behind it. But look at Donald Trump, and this isn't just a Donald Trump phenomenon. He's the master of this. I mean, he's a reality show host, right? He's clearly good at manipulating public opinion. Say
Mhm.
what you want about him, but on both sides of the aisle, it's punchy, it's sound bites, there's no intellectual weight or policy behind it, right? So when you have coupled with just like insanely violent, dehumanizing, aggressive rhetoric on both sides. I think right now, though, nothing like coming out of the administration is the worst. And then that spawns the kind of leaders we're talking about who don't know anything about leadership, because it attracts these kind of craven creatures that just completely terrible human beings. So then we have no leadership because the people who are succeeding are engaged in this ideological rhetoric, and then because we don't have real leaders, we have no coherent policies. So I see that as how it goes, right? Lack of leadership and violent language means that no policy, because nobody wants to talk about policy. Policy is
Right.
nuanced and it's not going to go viral. And people don't realize when politics becomes a reality television show, as it's been for a long time in this country, people want the clips, they want the drama, and that's not how societies function. That's certainly not how governments are run.
So choosing the right leadership is very important because I remember when Trump was running and everyone sort of had a sense, or many people rather than everyone, many people had a sense of his background, his attitude, um, aggressive attitude when it came to relationships with women. And many of his defenders would say, look, we're not asking for a priest. We're not looking for a saint. We know who he is, but we want someone to lead the nation. Aha. However, moral fortitude has its place. And if you have leaders who are immoral and are announcing it, they may sound incredible that they are a strong person, that they're going to lead the nation forward. But we know because of their um, lack of morals, that has a tremendous effect on the people they are leading. And so I think this has been an incredible lesson in it's not that the person is a priest. A priest is not necessarily running for the president of the United States. They've got their position. But you must have a leader who has a sense of morality and understands the importance of that morality um, for the people that they're leading.
Yeah, I agree. And the problem is we don't have leaders for a long time because of how corrupt, not only corrupt financially, but also how toxic the system is. It's not
Mm-hmm.
incentivizing decent people to run for office. So we're going to be left with these completely disruptive people. And I mean that across the board. I
Sure.
can't tell you a Democrat right now that I've never, and I've been voting since 2016. I know it's not that long, but still, I've never
I've
had a
got a few
candidate that
years on you.
you got a few. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you draw attention to that, but I've
That's
never
all
had a
right.
candidate I've been jazzed up about at all, even
Yeah.
remotely. And I worked on campaigns,
Yeah.
so that says something.
I agree
There's no
wholeheartedly.
one.
It's across the board. Yeah, it's
Uh,
across the board.
and I was a little too young to really appreciate this. I mean, I think Obama was the last one who, and I'll say as a Democrat, Obama was the last Democrat who was looking forward, not backwards. And that used to be our purview. We used to have this vision for the future. I think
It
Obama
did.
was the last Democrat too who thought of America as this bright, shining city upon a hill. And I think
Yeah.
part of the reason why Trump is part of the reason why conservative movements, at least in Europe and America, are doing conservative, MAGA, national. I'd say nationalist movements are doing so well, is because the left tends to just flagellate the country, right? Like the Britons don't want to hear about the sins of empire. Americans don't want to hear about slavery. Not because those things didn't happen, but to try on an individual level. I've made a lot of mistakes. I have plenty of flaws. I don't want to be defined by them.
Right.
And the Democrats, we used to be, let's put our flaws behind us and move forward together. And now when you've got this kind of progressive, more academic bent to a lot of this stuff, which is kind of rooted in a lot of Marxist thought, it's more highlighting the inequities in the system, which we should do, right? But you have to have, if you're going to highlight something, you need to have a way to move past it. And I don't see that. And when I talk about Obama, he offered a way to move past the sins, the original sin of this country of slavery.
Yes, and it's interesting in that you're so right. We had leaders at one time that we've always had problems, right? The nation has had plenty of problems to confront and deal with, but leadership, looking to the future, we are better today than we were yesterday. And when you are, it's like one of the things Donald Trump does say, which is, you say it enough times, then you believe it, right? So if you have a leader that's saying they're so horrible, they're so radical, they're no good, versus a leader that's saying, in spite of all of our challenges, we are Americans and we're joined together. In spite of everything that we have to overcome, we believe in each other and we fight for each other and we stand with each other. Well, those are two completely different mindsets coming from a leader. And so that matters. Problems will exist. The challenges are inherent. But the leadership and how they address them and how they support the nation and lead the nation is, in my opinion, what makes a huge, huge difference.
No, I agree. And part of this is, so this country was founded on an idea, which is, we take for granted, a beautiful thought that this country was formed on an aspirational idea that people can do better. Not only an aspirational idea that we're all created equal, but that we can do better. Not another country in the history of the world has been founded on that premise. And how rare that is and how noble that is. And that it was always about where we were going, not where we had been, right? And my problem with Donald Trump, my biggest problem with Donald Trump is that he is taking us away from that, consciously taking us away from that idea of where we were going. He's completely derailed that. And it's just the second most beautiful thing about this country is because of us being a nation of immigrants, there's no national culture. And the problem now, we have this white Christian ethno-nationalism that the MAGA movement is doing. It's disgusting. It's everything this country was founded in opposition to. Now, which is heartbreaking to me on the eve of our 250th birthday, that this is rearing its ugly head now. White Christian nationalism. I mean, for God's sake, the founders would be appalled. And it's just, when I was talking about citizenship earlier, this is, for years, it was who gets to be a citizen, defining who is a citizen, right? As far as I'm concerned, that's what we should be getting towards, a citizenship. And that's the definition of American as far as I'm concerned. Not this crap about ethnicity or religion or anything else. It's whether or not you're a citizen.
So at the end of the day, what gives you hope that thoughtful people from every different experience can build honest civic conversations?
Well, I think this encouraging seeing people moving away from the two major parties, I think that could backfire. I think in the event that a lot of the moderate free thinkers leave the parties, you're going to see the parties becoming even more entrenched in radicalism, right? Because you're not going to have any kind of competitive primaries. But I think what we need to do, and Substack is, at least thus far, I imagine it will tank like all the other social media platforms. But right now, it is a very wholesome community of people who are there, who want to share ideas with each other. They're not trolling one another. I think finding places like that where we can build our own communities and hear each other out away from the noise and the politicization of everything is the first step forward. Taking that time, I guess it's got to start online this day and age, to recognize our common humanity has to be the jumping off point for any kind of political change. And I would argue if we don't do it in this year, when we have a tailor-made opportunity with the 250th, to engage in this national renewal rooted in citizenship and our shared values as Americans, I'm afraid if we miss this opportunity, it won't come again. And I don't mean to say that to sound alarmist, but these are the stakes we're dealing with here. It is time to deprogram ourselves and move forward as a country.
Man, that's a tall order. And I would say that you're exactly right. That's exactly what we have to do is deprogram ourselves. But it's going to take, in my opinion, very strong leadership and very conscientious people, which I know and believe there are a lot of very conscientious people out there. One of the things I enjoy so much about talking with people like yourself in this platform here is that you discover so many people around this country. Out of the 330 million people, there are incredible people in this country who really believe in our democracy, fighting for it, and are working diligently behind the scenes. Leave us with something that is encouraging as we close out this conversation.
Well, I think what's encouraging, a lot of times you hear, and I've been prone to this myself, the rhetoric that this is the most polarized this country has ever been. And I used to counter that with saying, well, what about the 1960s? I think we passed the 1960s, but we haven't passed the 1860s, right? And that's something to remind ourselves that things have been worse in this country. And we came through okay. Better than okay, we came through stronger.
Yeah.
And the moment I saw an interesting, John Meacham, the author, gave a talk on his recent book, which is kind of a primary source. He said it's the best book he ever copyright or photocopied, where it was about all of these divergent voices that had been struggling. Frederick Douglass on the one hand, and then segregationists on the other hand. It was all these people trying to figure out what America means in these speeches and letters and what have you. And he gave a really rousing speech on the Upper East Side, full of secular liberals, if anywhere else, probably secular liberal capital of America, talking about how we cannot give up hope. And that to give up hope in a moment like this is to, and I firmly agree with this, to give up hope in a moment like this is to do an incredible dishonor to all of those who died at Gettysburg, all those who froze to death at Valley Forge, and who died at Normandy, let alone the people who died with the civil rights, pushing the civil rights movement forward. It is such a dishonor to all those buried at Arlington and all of those who were run down on the bridge in Selma, Alabama, to give up hope now when we can't steel our spines. If John Lewis could do it, we certainly can do it, because he faced much more difficult circumstances than I'll ever face.
Oh my gosh, yeah, daily, physically, emotionally, all of it, and we all are responsible for this democracy. It's part of the agreement we have as an American, as a citizen of this country. That is our cross to bear, that we're in it, and we have to do all that we can to maintain it and make it better than it's ever been. Look to the future. I have to say, Conor, that I always appreciate our conversations and talking with you. And I think what stands out to me most today is the idea that stepping outside of ideology, it does not mean that we are abandoning our beliefs. It means that we are becoming more aware of the frameworks that shape those beliefs. And that's not always easy work, but it does feel necessary. So thank you for bringing your thoughtfulness, your writing, and your willingness to explore this space with me. And I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation another time. I am Addison Witt. Thank you all for listening and being a part of this. This is Defensive Democracy, and we will see you next time.
Let me introduce you to an organization called Defensive Democracy. We're a New York-based nonprofit with chapters across the United States. Our mission is to empower pro-democracy movements at a local level with the goal of protecting the Constitution and other foundational American documents. We have a coalition of like-minded organizations, including faith leaders, veterans, and students, and we work to promote democracy, stand up for inclusivity, and fight censorship and book bans in our libraries and education system. Well, for just $5 a month, about the price of one coffee-type beverage, you can support Defensive Democracy's mission, and you can make a difference in your local community and really in the entire nation. That's just $5 a month. I'm going to say that again. Not a day, not a week, $5 a month. One day out of 30, you can brew your coffee at home and stand up for the America that you know and love. So scan this QR code or visit defensivedemocracy.org today. Put on a pot of coffee. We got work to do.